In 1396, the largest Crusader army Europe had seen in a century marched to destroy an empire. They were the finest knights in the world, clad in gleaming steel, dripping with gold, and absolutely certain of their victory. But they made one fatal mistake. They woke the thunderbolt. This is the story of how pride led 25,000 of Europe's most elite warriors into a trap that would end in one of the most brutal disasters in military history. The storm they were marching to confront had a name: Sultan Bayazid I. He was a man forged in the crucible of conquest, a ruler who had more than earned his title, Yildirim, the Thunderbolt. His story began on the bloody fields of Kosovo, where his father, Sultan Murad, was assassinated at the very moment of his triumph over the Serbian princes. In the chaotic aftermath, Bayazid acted with the ruthless speed that would define his reign. His own brother, a potential rival for the throne, was summoned to his tent and without ceremony strangled with a bowstring. In a single day, Bayazid had avenged his father and secured his power. It was a grim omen for his enemies. Where his predecessors had moved with caution, expanding their empire slowly over generations, Bayazid moved with breathtaking speed. In a single whirlwind campaign of just a few years, he stormed across Anatolia, conquering, annexing, and intimidating the rival Turkish emirates into submission, uniting the Turkish world under his single, iron-willed banner. He was the first Ottoman ruler to truly command an empire. Then he turned his gaze west. The Balkans, a fractured mosaic of Christian kingdoms, fell before him. He annexed Bulgaria, crushed the Serbian princes, and made them his vassals, and reduced the once mighty Byzantine Empire to little more than the city of Constantinople itself. A hollowed-out ghost he was casually besieging. His army was a modern war machine, a stark contrast to the feudal levies of Europe. Its terrifying core was the Janissaries. These soldiers were a unique and fearsome invention. Taken as boys from Christian lands under the Devshirme system, they were converted to Islam and raised in Spartan barracks. Stripped of all family ties, forbidden to marry, their entire existence from childhood was dedicated to the art of war. Their only family was their core, their only father, the Sultan. This psychological conditioning created a brotherhood of steel, the most disciplined and deadly infantry in the world. Backing them was the elite Sipahi cavalry, warriors granted lands in exchange for military service. They were every bit the match for a European knight in armor and courage, but far superior in tactical flexibility, trained to feign retreats, swarm the flanks, and respond instantly to commands. And leading the charge were the Akinji, the light cavalry raiders, who swept ahead of the main army to scout, pillage, and spread terror. This was the Ottoman tide, and by the late 14th century, it was threatening to break the last Christian wall in the east, the sprawling, vulnerable kingdom of Hungary. Its ruler, King Sigismund, understood the danger in his bones. He was a shrewd European prince, a man who would one day become Holy Roman Emperor, but on the Hungarian frontier, he was a battle-hardened realist. He had fought the Turks before in indecisive, bloody border skirmishes, and the experience had taught him a harsh lesson. Their discipline was superior to the individualistic valor of his own knights. Looking east, he saw the shadow of Bayazid falling over everything. Looking west, he saw a Christian Europe dangerously distracted. The two great military powers, England and France, were mired in the final bitter stages of the 100 Years' War. The papacy, the spiritual heart of Christendom, was split in two by the Great Schism, with rival popes in Rome and Avignon hurling insults and excommunications at each other. How could you call a crusade when the two heads of the church were at war? Sigismund knew he could not stand alone. He sent desperate pleas across the continent. His envoys gave impassioned speeches in the courts of Burgundy and France, painting a terrifying picture of the Ottoman storm about to break over Europe. Slowly, the West listened. The Maritime Republic of Venice and the Knights of St. John pledged their powerful fleets. German princes and Polish knights offered their swords. But the greatest response came from France, whose Duke, Philip the Bold of Burgundy, saw a chance for immense prestige. He agreed to fund and send a massive force, led by his own 24-year-old son and heir. A new crusade was born. It was to be the grandest army Europe had assembled in generations, a force destined to smash the Sultan and save Christendom. But as this great force began to gather, it was already poisoned by a fatal flaw, a crack in its foundation that the Sultan was already planning to exploit. A river of steel and silk flowed east across Europe. This was the flower of Western chivalry, an army so confident that its noble leaders were already arguing over who would get the honor of being the first to ride through the gates of Constantinople. At their heart were the French, commanded by a young, ambitious, and utterly inexperienced duke, a man desperate to earn a glorious name for himself. He was surrounded by the most famous warriors of the age, including a wise, grizzled admiral who had fought the English for decades, and a pious marshal who was considered the living embodiment of the chivalric ideal. But their wisdom was drowned out by the chorus of youthful arrogance. They were a spectacle of martial wealth. Their armor was the pinnacle of medieval technology, custom-fitted plates from the finest workshops in Milan, so expensive that a single suit cost more than a peasant's entire farm. Their war horses were massive beasts, bred for size and strength, draped in silk coverings bearing their coats of arms. Their camp was a traveling city of indulgence. A vast train of wagons carried not just weapons and supplies, but chests of fine clothes for victory celebrations, barrels of Burgundy's finest wine, and even court musicians. As this magnificent force traveled through the German principalities on its way to Hungary, they were feted as heroes. Their journey was less a military march and more a victory tour that had somehow begun before the war. This constant adoration only inflated their already boundless arrogance. When they finally arrived in the Hungarian capital of Buda, the deep cultural clash became immediately apparent. The French nobles looked down on what they saw as the rustic, unsophisticated Hungarian court. They scoffed at their allies' lighter armor and different tactics. The friction was immediate and constant. There were arguments over supplies, over lodging, over who had precedence in the order of march. King Sigismund, the seasoned commander, was horrified. He tried to forge a unified command, to instill a sense of caution and respect for the enemy. He explained that in a Turkish war, scouting was everything, that discipline, not just valor, won battles. The French laughed. They were on a holy quest. What need was there for strategy when God was on their side? They saw the Ottomans as a disorganized rabble that would break and run at the first sight of their gleaming lances. The combined camp became a showcase of this fatal pride. While Sigismund tried to plan a campaign, the French nobles held lavish feasts and tournaments. The veteran French admiral tried to counsel his young duke, warning him that the Hungarian king's advice was sound, born of harsh experience. He was ignored, his caution dismissed as the timidity of old age. An army that believed it was invincible. It was beautiful, powerful, and utterly dysfunctional. This wasn't one army, but two, a force at war with itself, marching blindly towards a commander who never lost, and who was already waiting for them. The crusade began not with a glorious battle, but with a brutal, self-inflicted stain. As the combined host marched down the Danube, a great artery flowing deep into enemy territory, their first objectives were the Bulgarian cities on its banks. The first, Vidin, surrendered immediately, further boosting the Crusaders' sense of invincibility. Their second target, the city of Rachawa, was garrisoned by Ottoman troops who chose to fight. The siege was short and savage. The French knights, impatient and eager for blood, disdained the slow work of building siege engines. They led a ferocious frontal assault on the walls. The fighting was brutal, but the sheer weight and fanaticism of the Crusaders overwhelmed the defenders. The city fell. In the aftermath, a chilling decision was made. Disregarding pleas for mercy from King Sigismund, who argued that sparing the prisoners was both Christian and strategically wise, the French knights led a massacre. Drunk on victory and bloodlust, they put the entire captured garrison to the sword, along with hundreds of the city's inhabitants. It was a catastrophic blunder. Sigismund was aghast, seeing it not only as a sin but as a guarantee of equal brutality from the enemy. They had won their first victory, but celebrated it with an act of shocking cruelty. They had no idea they were sealing their own fate and giving the Sultan the only justification he needed for the terrible reckoning that was to come. From Rochoa, they marched on the formidable fortress of Nicopolis, a key Ottoman stronghold. They laid siege, but it was a lazy, uncoordinated effort. For weeks, the vast Crusader camp became a scene of complacency. They held tournaments within sight of the walls and sent insulting challenges to the city's commander. They were so secure in their belief that Bayazid was hundreds of miles away that they posted few guards and sent out few scouts. They assumed wrong. While the Crusaders feasted, Bayazid moved. Hearing of the Crusade, he abandoned his siege of Constantinople and force-marched his entire army north at a blistering pace. His soldiers, accustomed to his punishing speed, marched day and night, eating in the saddle, covering terrain in days that the Crusaders had assumed would take weeks. A parallel narrative was unfolding. The Crusaders, slow, decadent, and blind. The Ottomans, fast, disciplined, and focused. The first sign of trouble came when Crusader foraging parties began to vanish. The French nobles dismissed them as local Turkish raiders. The shock when the truth finally dawned was immense. The Turkish vanguard swarmed over the horizon, driving the Crusaders' pickets back in a panic. The enemy they had dismissed was here. The hunter had become the hunted, but the real trap wasn't the army in front of them. It was the one they couldn't see. The morning mist of September 25th broke to reveal the Ottoman army, a silent, disciplined sea of soldiers. But in the eyes of the French knights, this wasn't a threat, it was the stage for their glory. In a furious final war council, King Sigismund desperately tried to impose some order. "Sire," he pleaded with the young French duke, "I have seen the Turkish way of war. They place their weakest troops, their rabble, at the front to absorb our charge and exhaust our horses. I beg you, let my Hungarians and Wallachians advance first. We will break this first line and expose their true strength. Then, you and your magnificent knights can deliver the decisive, battle-winning blow." The French nobles exploded in anger. They saw this as a mortal insult, an attempt by Sigismund to steal their honor. The young duke, his pride stung, declared, "It would be a great shame upon us if we were to let any other lead the way. We have come from afar for this glory, and we shall take it." The veteran French admiral, his face grim, made one last attempt at reason, but he was shouted down, accused of cowardice. The decision was made. France would charge first. Ignoring all orders from Sigismund, they unleashed their attack. It was a thunderous, awesome sight. Thousands of the world's finest knights, a wave of steel and horseflesh, crashed into the Ottoman front line. Just as Sigismund had predicted, the poorly armed infantry bait could not withstand the impact. The French charge shattered them, carving a bloody path through. They galloped onward, drunk on what seemed to be an easy victory, trampling the Ottoman archers who stood behind the front line. But their massive war horses were tiring, their momentum slowing as they charged uphill over broken ground. As they crested a low rise, their triumphant cheers died in their throats. There, waiting for them, drawn up in perfect, silent battle array, was the real Ottoman army. Thousands of elite Sipahi heavy cavalry, fresh and perfectly formed, sat on their mounts. On their flanks stood the unwavering lines of Janissary infantry, a wall of white turbans and grim faces. And between the exhausted French and this fresh enemy was a nightmarish discovery. A forest of thousands of sharpened wooden stakes, hidden from view by the slope, planted in the ground, with the express purpose of destroying a cavalry charge. The French momentum died instantly. Horses, maddened with pain, impaled themselves on the stakes. Knights were thrown from their saddles into the mud. The magnificent, unstoppable charge dissolved into a chaotic, helpless scrum of flailing men and animals. The trap had sprung. The Sipahis now countercharged into their flanks, while the Janissaries advanced on foot, their razor-sharp scimitars and poleaxes making short, brutal work of the heavily armored, immobile French knights who were now trapped on foot. The greatest cavalry force in Europe was being systematically surrounded and dismantled. Seeing the disaster, Sigismund committed the rest of his army in a desperate attempt to save them. The Hungarians and their allies crashed into the Ottoman lines, and for a moment the battle raged on even terms. But it was too late. The heart of the Crusader army had been ripped out in one foolish, glorious charge. The battle was no longer about victory. It was about survival. The battle was over. The silence on the field was broken only by the cries of the wounded and the cold orders of the victors. The pride of European chivalry now lay shattered in the mud of Nicopolis. Once the French vanguard was annihilated, the rest of the Crusader army, despite fighting valiantly, was doomed. The final, decisive blow came from an unexpected quarter. A contingent of 1,500 Serbian knights, Christian vassals sworn to the Sultan, launched a devastating charge into the Hungarian flank. The sight of Christians fighting for the Ottoman Sultan shattered the Crusaders' morale. The Allied lines broke, and the great Crusader army dissolved into a panicked rout. Men threw down their weapons and ran for the Danube, only to be cut down by the pursuing Ottoman cavalry. King Sigismund was forced from the field, his bodyguards forming a desperate circle around him, fighting a heroic last stand to get him to a small boat on the river. He escaped with his life, a king watching helplessly as his kingdom's defenders were slaughtered on the shore. He is said to have looked back at the carnage and lamented, "We lost the day by the pride and vanity of these French. If they had believed my advice, we had been in force sufficient to have fought our enemies." He would eventually make his way back to Hungary, a king without an army, his grand crusade in ruins. The following morning, Sultan Bayazid toured the battlefield. His initial elation at the scale of his victory turned to cold fury when he discovered that the Crusaders had massacred their prisoners at Rochoa. His retribution was swift and terrible. He ordered that, with the exception of a few high-born nobles to be held for an enormous ransom, all of the thousands of captives were to be executed. For an entire day, the pride of European nobility, the knights who had set out from their castles with such arrogance, were brought before the Sultan in small groups and systematically killed. The young French duke, now known to history as John the Fearless, was forced to watch, to identify the men of highest rank to be spared for ransom, thereby condemning the rest. It was a horrifying, personal reckoning for the pride that had led them all to this moment. It took years for Burgundy and France to raise the colossal sum, crippling their economies, to secure his release. It was more than a defeat. It was the death of the Grand Crusade. The myth of the invincible Western Knight, the core of medieval military doctrine, was shattered on that Bulgarian field. The disaster secured Ottoman domination of the Balkans for the next century and left Hungary, and by extension Central Europe, dangerously exposed. Bayazid, the Thunderbolt, now stood unopposed. Pride, as this battle proves, is a far deadlier weapon than any sword. For more stories where a single human flaw changed the world, subscribe and let us know what battle we should cover next.